First order optimal strategies in TTRPGs are the strategies with the most amount of raw power to the least amount of effort. They are where the water likes to flow. Water will always take the quickest path to the sea. When we're looking at these first order optimal strategies, FOO strategies for this video, and really when we're talking about them, the FOO strategy is what your players fall back to initially in combat. So if you're looking at a wizard, for instance, the FOO strategy of most 5th edition wizards is Fireball. It's become a meme at this point. What's the wizard doing? We don't care. We're casting Fireball. Now, these are great sometimes because the FOO strategy allows the players to get comfortable. For a barbarian, part of the FOO strategy might be bonus action rage. It's something you're going to do every time. But because it's something you do every time, it can quickly become less interesting to not only the players, but you as a DM as well. You're removing all the complexity because, yeah, a wizard casting Fireball in a group of kobolds the first time, that's pretty cool. The third time, yeah, it's still good. When it's the 10th time and you're only casting Fireball, that's when combats can feel a little monotonous.
Or so you're saying the issue with those strategies is roughly that they're a lot of fun, but that they get a little old.
It's not even that they're a lot of fun, because oftentimes, across all systems, players will optimize the fun out of a game. Despite something being the least fun or the least interesting thing to do, players will do it over and over and over again. This is grinding in RPG games. It's, again, these very simple, if not broken, combos in fighting games, spamming the same move over and over again.
Famously, there is a quote that says that given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun out of a game. And if you're someone who's playing a game like this and you don't know what that means, it's basically saying that people will do what they need to do to win or to be effective, but they will do that even to the detriment of having a good time at the game in the first place.
Absolutely. So our job as dungeon masters, I think, is to address these FOO strategies and make it so that they stop becoming the most optimal strategy in every combat. I like to put this out there because I'm not saying to counter the FOO strategy intentionally every single combat. However, it should be such that players have to experiment with their strategy. They need to grow, evolve, or maybe they look at a combat and they say, I don't know if I can use this FOO strategy because we've encountered enemies in the past that have resistance to fire damage, or that have complete immunity to fire damage. So maybe I save my Fireball until turn 2, until I know more about whatever I'm fighting. And even that, I think, is enough.
Kind of like you're saying, the point here isn't stop using the strategy. You've won when your players say, when your players even question, is this the strategy? Should I be using the Fireball this round? And if they're asking the question with intentionality, then you've already done a lot of the work.
I would agree. I would absolutely agree. So part of that is, now once we know what the FOO strategy is, it's going,
yeah, how do you get around it?
Yeah, well, how do you get around it? So part of that, I think, really boils down to enemy type and having a diverse typing of enemies that you can throw at your players to counter certain FOO strategies. So, for instance, if you have the wizard that's always casting Fireball, making sure in your campaign that you're eventually able to build up to an encounter with fire elementals. Or if you can situate it so a particular group of enemies has a really high dexterity save. So the Fireball spell requires a dexterity save from enemies. Right. If you're having a group of, let's say, assassins with evasion, and they're attacking the wizard, that Fireball is going to be much less effective. That Fireball might be doing no damage in a round. So part of that is that specific enemy design to put forward the challenge to the initial FOO strategy. But also, I think this is very important when we're talking about these enemies, and I'd love to get your opinion on this as well. It's telegraphing what the enemies are good at, and letting the player whose FOO strategy you're challenging come to the realization by themselves that, oh, this FOO strategy is no longer as effective as something else I might have in my arsenal.
Not only, though, I will say that enemy is a great way to challenge a FOO strategy, but also terrain does a great job at that. For instance, your fireball mage is a lot less effective in a room that's less than 20 by 20. It starts to become a very dangerous spell to cast if they can't get out of the room. Similarly speaking, like, your rogue who relies on sneak attacks doesn't do nearly as well with like a cover that totally obscures. There are a million different strategies you can use for any given thing just to make it more interesting for one combat or two. And I think my favorite versions of this aren't necessarily even things that totally shut down one of these strategies, but just make it less effective. Certainly fire-resistant enemies will go like, yeah, of course, they're not going to shoot fire elementals with fireballs, and they will learn very quickly that's a bad idea. But it's almost even better when it's something where it's like, well, I can use fireball, but these enemies are super spread out. I'm going to get one guy. And it's just like, that doesn't feel awesome. So there tends to be a like more, I want to switch to something else type thing. But to speak more to your point, telegraphing stuff, it's awesome when you can give your players, if you're specifically trying to challenge one player, I find that like a lot of times it's a good idea to offer them something specific that they could do instead. Bonus points if your normally super tanky character is up against a bunch of creatures that walk up and make a saving throw attack. Even better though if this is the character with the magic sword and he's the only one that can do full damage to them, and it's like, oh, they seem to be really vulnerable to your magic weapon, so like maybe try running after them.
The worst thing I think we can do when we're trying to address the FOO strategy is to make it so that there is no secondary strategy available. It's the problem of saying, well, my barbarian is doing so much damage in melee combat. Here, let me put a flying enemy into this combat and it will never land. And the barbarian goes, well, I don't have my javelins on me today, and I wouldn't do a lot of damage with that anyway. I'm just going to hold my action for the entire combat. That, I think, is what really takes the sales out of players, because we're not giving a valid secondary mode of impacting the battle. And, having those secondary modes, and you as a DM identifying, okay, what's a secondary niche they can fulfill in combat is very important. I don't know if you do this, but at the early levels, I'm constantly looking at player characters in those early combats and saying, well, what are they doing initially? What are they best at in combat? And what is their secondary benefit that they can give to the overall party? So, Barbarian, a character that does a lot of damage. However, they might also be great at things like grappling or taking damage. So, if the characters in this combat can take damage for others from this flying enemy that we might be fighting, now the barbarian has a chance to shine as they're running along the battlefield. They're taking this damage, or they are the one who's single-handedly grabbing a chain and grappling this creature to the ground in whatever way we actually put into the combat itself. But I would also like to wrap around to something you said before, because this, I think, is the easiest way to address FOO strategies while not being noticed. And that's the initial placement of combats, as we were kind of talking about earlier, enemy placement at the start of combats. This also shifts into terrain and even where the party members are being placed as the combat is beginning. Because even just changing starting positions and starting scenarios, huge. Because we want the player characters to win at the end of the day. So it's not how do we make it so the players can't win. It's how do we make it really so that they win slower and in a more difficult or interesting way. So for Fireball, I love to start encounters with wizards where we might have a bunch of goblins drop from the ceiling and now they're surrounding the group of frontline characters. Oh no!
The Omaha Goblin Drop. It's a classic move.
It's a classic move. And so now we have a situation where the wizard has to either say, all right, I'm going to drop a fireball on my own allies, or I'll put a secondary spell like Scorching Ray or Magic Missile, and I'll do something else, but I'll have to think and I'll have to make those quick adjustments.
Here's another, if I'm going to push this, I'm going to push this one more level. So we said at first, like modify the enemies, and then we're saying like, okay, but you could also modify the starting positions. Okay, DMs, here's a secret tip that will make you have to worry about this like 70% less without ever thinking about it. Just make sure your combat's goal isn't always kill the enemies in the first place. Automatically, there will be other things for your characters to have to worry about. If they have to pull levers all over the battlefield to stop this bomb from going off or dam from collapsing, then suddenly, like, they have to do something else. If the fight's basically, like, your first order optimal strategies for player characters are almost always based off this kind of white room, what if I'm just fighting these guys? Nobody's first order strategy is cast Mage Hand on the first round. Like, nobody thinks about that. If you're messing with the thing that your players are caring about in your fights in the first place, a lot of this problem just disappears for you without having to worry about it and without ever breaking your verisimilitude.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that we always miss when we're talking about the real crunchy parts of D&D, or really any TTRPG. We always come into it because D&D is a combat-oriented system with roots in wargaming. And in wargames, for the most part, even if there are other objectives, we're trying to kill the enemy army. But when we're not trying to do that, we can have spells that otherwise don't see a lot of play, and they become now first-order optimal strategies. Like, I will stand up on a pedestal for a second, and I will defend one of my favorite underrated spells, Rope Trick. For those of you that don't know, Rope Trick is a second-level spell that creates a rope that can go up to 60 feet in the air and creates a dimension where you and your party can hide out in. It is an action to cast, and it lasts for an hour, and it is not concentration. Rope Trick is great for so many combats where you either need to keep something away, you need to dodge an oncoming AoE attack, whatever. Rope Trick becomes one of these first order optimal strategies, or not even first order, but second or third order, when we stop looking at combat as just hit points that need to be reduced to zero. We give secondary and tertiary objectives that allow these other parts of the game to be woven together. I think those are some of the best combats. It's why I love it when combats have a role-playing aspect where maybe as you're fighting, you are trying to call out to the enemy side and you're trying to get other enemy minions to lay down their weapons, or you're trying to get civilians to flee, and there's a bonus for getting civilians out of the area, because then it allows classes like bards and sorcerers or paladins to come into play with their charisma. Or if you're hidden or searching for hidden items, then the wisdom casters, those with higher perception checks, and the rogues, they become so valuable in combat. When dungeon masters fall into first order optimal setups, that leads to first order optimal strategies. And I don't know if
great point.
I don't know if it's ever been brought up, at least in the design circles that I run in, but that is, I think, a major problem for a lot of core design that pops up. Because, when things are working, we don't want to change the formula. We've already talked about game series, right now, today, where they have not changed the formula in 15, 20 years. But it is in the changing of the formula and the newness that gets added that allows us to draw the best from any system in any scenario. So that's, I think, one of the other biggest ways, coming up with these new scenarios for both you and your players to experience, which is difficult. It's hard. I wonder if we could start getting into, all right, where do we start when we're looking at coming up with these scenarios and breaking habits so that we can get around these strategies? And I wonder, for you, when you feel like you need a little bit of spice, when you feel like you're falling into a rut, what's the first thing that you get up to?
Well, first I have to bring up one minor point, just a small asterisk for everyone about to go home and use rope trick on your DMs. Rope is actually not included, so do bring your own rope.
Very true.
But so just note that in the video, editors put an asterisk, rope not included on the video. Let's talk about cool encounters. I love every DM has a specialty, and my specialty is awesome set piece, just rad cinematic encounters. That's what I do. I love that stuff. I love drawing inspiration from everywhere and everything when I think about the encounters. You can do what we call top-down design, where you look at, like, you have an idea about what, like, an encounter should be narratively, and then you figure out what mechanics. Or you might have a cool mechanical idea, like, I need them to be able to run away from this black hole at this much speed per round, and then if I know that they have to run, how do I design an encounter that's interesting if they're having to use all their movement? You can do it either way. I love looking at encounters like that and trying to figure out, like, what makes this one unique and different. Like, one of my favorite movie series for drawing inspiration for encounters is Pirates of the Caribbean. Man, the action scenes in that movie are rad. I always think back to the second movie where there's this fantastic sword fight scene where there are three guys on top of a wind or a water mill. One of them has like a key, like a MacGuffin that's needed for the plot. Jack Sparrow, famous Jack Sparrow, needs that, so he convinces the other two guys to start fighting each other. So our fight starts, in D&D terms, with two people in combat and a third person trying to steal from the second person. He successfully steals the key, starts to run, and as the two other ones are fighting, they stand on top of the moving water wheel, which then breaks and starts rolling down the terrain, crashing over the guy with the key, Jack Sparrow, who gets stuck in it and is now inside of it running, trying to hold on to the key, as he sometimes swaps places with the people on top of the water wheel and then has to fight them. This just incredible dynamic combat. I often, as a rule of thumb, say this. If your player characters are making the same decision in combat for more than 2 turns in a row, you should probably do something to mix it up. Like, if your choice is I stand still and attack for more than 2 rounds, or I stand right here and cast an offensive spell for more than 2 rounds, something should probably be different. Do something that's more interesting. Something's got to change. So, tips on, like, where to go. Actually, wait, I'm going to pause. How do you, Colin, tell me how you come up with interesting set pieces and what you start to think about, and then I will hit you back with how I actually do it IRL.
Right. So whenever I'm coming up with a set piece, specifically when I'm trying to address my own first order setup that I've come into, I usually start from, all right, what is a situation I'm trying to end up in, or what is an end point? So the situation that I would be thinking about if I'm using your Pirates of the Caribbean scenario is, right, I really want a fight revolving around running on a water wheel. Well, how do I get there? And how do I implement those mechanics? I think about, all right, I probably need mechanics around movement on the water wheel. I'd probably need mechanics in case you're about to fall off the water wheel. And maybe even the change of direction of a water wheel. Because I don't think I've seen Pirates of the Caribbean 2, but I'm assuming there's a moment when they reverse the turning of the water wheel, kind of like log rolling or whatever that sport is. And
if they didn't, they should have. It would have been cool.
Yeah, or something along those lines. So I'm figuring out what's the situation, what are the mechanics I'm going to need, and then reverse engineering. So, in my own made-up scenario, they are having a conversation at the top of the water wheel as something is about to happen. And we might have a moment where there's an explosion. The water wheel starts to fall. Now the party is on top of the water wheel fighting this group of enemies, and now we have the set piece. Now something is interesting. And as I'm thinking about that, I'm also going, okay, for me, combats are best when they change every 2 rounds at the least, right? So I go, all right, for this scenario, we are 2 rounds on the wheel. At the end of those 2 rounds, it's rolled enough and to maybe hit something. So now we're flung off the wheel. Maybe we're flung into a kind of a white, quick flowing river for another round. And then after another round or two after that, we come to a stop at the end point of a river or a pond or something where we finally continue the combat there. So I'm thinking about not only the specific scenario that I'm looking at, but also adding in dynamic elements where I can, so that I can throw those switches in combat if ever things get too normal. But in terms of everything else, then I'm taking a step back and going, okay, well, what specific strategies, what first order strategies will be affected amongst my players? So if I have a player who is constantly in ranged combat, running to the back of whatever combat map we're in, well, now I've disrupted that first order optimal strategy because they can't run anywhere. They're running on top of this water wheel, and so they're not able to get the same type of distance. They become more so close quarters in their combat actions. So I've disrupted that. I might have disrupted the wizard's fireball, but I haven't disrupted the barbarian. I can still look at the ranged combatant and say, well, okay, they probably have high dexterity, so maybe they can use dexterity saves to help reverse the turning of the water wheel in some way as it's rolling downhill, or somehow do more on this wheel with their dexterity, or even though they're not fighting, they're putting the enemies at a disadvantage. And then I would say, all right, well, I have to solve for the wizard. What can they do on the water wheel? And it's just this entire process of going, well, okay, I'm affecting this, but now I need to figure out what's a potential secondary option and even a tertiary option. And once I get all of that situated, then I'm able to put an interesting combat forward. And I think this might sound like a lot to some DMs, but once you do it a few times, I think it becomes really second nature in truth, where I have a concept, we slowly go about implementing it, and then it's just a quick think about, all right, how does this impact my party? And making sure that for a character like the wizard, maybe there's a spell they have in their arsenal that if it's cast can help bring the water wheel to a stop, or maybe accelerate the water wheel or something. But that's usually how I go about things. I start from particular situation, then I move to mechanics surrounding it, what dynamic changes I'm going to make to the combat so that if it goes for more than 2 rounds, it can still feel very fresh, and then what's the overall impact to my player characters.
Yeah, I'll even say, like, if it sounds like a lot, if you're listening to this and going like, oh my god, I have to figure out what, for every player character, what their first order optimal strategy is, and then how it can be different, and you're probably working too hard already. You only need to disrupt this kind of strategy for probably a couple of your party members at a time. Mm-hmm. It's cool if you only disrupt it for 2 of them, and the other 2, what if the barbarian still rages? That's fine as long as the range character still does something different. You can get the barbarian next fight. After all, we're not trying. We don't have to be imminently disruptive of every element, every single fight. That's way too much work, frankly. You'll burn yourself out as a DM. So I'd say, get a couple of them down. Feel good about that. When I'm making these, I think one of the first things I do, I want to come up with something that seems evocative and exciting for my players first. So I'm going to be thinking about movie scenes and book scenes I've watched or read. I'm going to be thinking about situations I think would be exciting. What if you're in a fight in a building that's falling over onto another building? Wouldn't that be crazy? You're running up one building, jumping through the windows of the other one. And then just like you, I start thinking okay, how do I implement that in a game? Sometimes the answer to that question is well, I'm not using grids, I'm not using maps. I just kind of ad-lib situations on the fly, and you know what? That's great for a lot of them. But sometimes if I'm trying to go all out on making something special, then I really will start thinking about how do I construct a building with multi-layer sets, or how do I do something like that? And then I come up with just sort of round by round ideas for okay, the first round this is going on, it's going to be a normal fight. The second round, The bad guys will detonate the gunpowder in the room, and that's going to start the building collapsing. The third round, the building's going to be 45 degrees. The fourth round, it's going to hit the other building, and and then the fifth round, they're going to have to start saving people and fighting the bad guys. Thinking stuff like that. And by the way, something you said, great rule of thumb for this, and I'm almost sad that we didn't get to it till this deep in the question. If you're wondering about hey, what pace are the things supposed to be happening? In general, it's every round. That seems like a lot, but rounds take a while in TTRPGs, and you'd be surprised that if you don't make them react immediately, they tend to just sort of not react at all, or one thing happens in the whole fight. So on the whole, I'd say if you're doing something that you want to feel interesting and dynamic, the pace of that is every single turn they have to do something about it. For a run-of-the-mill fight, if you just ad-lib this fight out of nowhere, yeah, sure, once every other round, good enough. But if you're trying to make it special, every single round.
I would even go further than that and say for those really special fights, I'm doing something about every half a round, where it's enough of a dynamic change where maybe I'm not doing something colossal, but if we're taking that falling building, first round we're in the building, halfway through that's when the gunpowder is detonated. We're falling at the beginning of round 2, and maybe then at the start of round 3, the end of round 2, we're actually hitting the next building because it's quicker. Because at least for me, in terms of how I run my combats, 3 to 4 rounds is considered, the about average for that. And so trying to predict anything beyond that usually just doesn't happen for me and my groups. So for that, I would say going a little bit quicker, if that is your average, would probably be best. But I think for you, Trent, do your combats usually go 4, 5, 6 rounds?
I think on average, mine go about 4 rounds.
Okay,
maybe
yeah.
4 to 5 rounds. But impressive one-upping me there, man, every half turn. Well, fine, Colin, I'm going to start doing all my stuff every quarter of a round. How about that, huh? On every player's turn, something blows up from now on.
It's great. See, we joke, but I do think, in a way, that is the ideal, to make it so there is this constant dynamism in a combat where every single turn everybody's locked in because we don't know what's happening next. Because I think it's very easy for players to check out when it's not their turn. But when there's a change happening to the battlefield, when an enemy is doing something new, or other players are having to react or changing the overall dynamics, when the goal is not reducing the enemies to 0, when we have other objectives that are trying to be solved, I watch all my players lock in to every single turn, and they go, wait a minute, that combat was 2 hours? It felt like 30 minutes. And I think it's these techniques that we're talking about that really help to elicit those moments and those experiences.
You heard it here first, folks. Every turn, explosions. That's the key. Every turn, explosions.
If it's good enough for the Fast and the Furious franchise, it's good enough for us.
I mean, that's true.